our first book was by a poet named W.D. Snodgrass, who was best known for, before that, a collection called The Heart's Needle that actually won the Pulitzer Prize. So if you can imagine, this young poet's first book wins the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah. He's
writing a new book, and he's having trouble getting it published, in part because it was called The Fuhrer Bunker, and that was Boa's first book.
Let's repeat the nonconformist oath. I promise to be different. I promise to be unique. I promise not to repeat things other people say.
Welcome back to Positive Blatherings, and this new season, it wasn't intentional, but it's kind of, actually the end of last season and the beginning of this season has really turned into a very author-focused, book-focused season, which is just a happy accident. I love it. I've always talked about how much respect I have for authors. Anyone that can finish a book, that can write a book and finish it and put it out there, has my complete respect. So what better way to talk about that than to talk with my guest here, Peter Connors. He's the publisher and executive director of BOA Editions right here in Rochester, New York. How you doing, Peter?
Good. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Great for you to be here. And you brought me a stack of books here, which I always love. These are now, what are these local authors, or these are just ones that you guys put out?
Yeah, those are just books that we publish. So we, I should say right away that the BOA is celebrating its 50th anniversary as a nonprofit independent publishing house, which is an incredible milestone for a small nonprofit of any kind, much less a place that focuses on putting out poetry. And quite honestly, it makes us one of the longest running independent presses in the country.
Wow.
So hopefully something for everybody in Rochester to be particularly proud of. And so what I brought you is just a sampling of books, some different poetry books, and we also do a couple books of fiction per year. Mostly we focus on poetry, but we do some short story collections as well. So that's what those are.
Wow. So that's very niche to be in, almost specifically poetry.
Yeah. Yeah. So I will, I'll give you, if you're interested, I'll give you a little quick overview of BOA. So BOA started in 1976. It was founded by somebody named Al Poulin, who is a professor at Brockport and also a poet. And he ran the reading series there where they would bring in authors and so forth. And, until the 1970s, there was a little bit of like independent publishing, but it really wasn't a big thing like it is now. In part, the technology wasn't there, and the distribution and all the different things you need to do with publishing weren't really in place. And so we see across the country around the mid-1970s, there's sort of a DIY movement where people go, maybe I can publish books, maybe. And a lot of times they were poets who were like, not sought out by mainstream publishing. And so, poetry has always sort of existed a little bit in the margins. And these folks figured out, Al Poulin being one of them, maybe I can publish a book, and who do I talk to about that, and how do I do it, and working with a typesetter and things like that. And at that point, it was all very, mechanical. There was no computers involved and things like that. So he got into publishing. Our first book was by a poet named W.D. Snodgrass, who was best known for, before that, a collection called The Heart's Needle that actually won the Pulitzer Prize. So if you can imagine, this young poet's first book wins the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
He's writing a new book, and he's having trouble getting it published, in part because it was called The Fuhrer Bunker, and that was Boa's first book. But the poet was really trying to get inside the sort of thoughts and consciousness and the thought process of Nazis, German citizens, folks who lived through World War II, specifically from a German perspective. I think to show, quite honestly, that they started out at least as just normal folks, who were had all the sort of regular concerns and so forth. And then he gets into all, the depth of it more deeply. But I think it was, this was he started working on it in the 60s, and he was a vet, so it wasn't that far removed from World War II itself. And it really set a lot of people off. You know, it was sort of like maybe they didn't want to hear that possibly, you know, a regular German townsperson, right?
Yeah.
Could become a Nazi, right?
Right.
Which I think is really important for us all to sort of know and be aware of. So anyway, that became BOA's first book. So it was sort of like, you know, in a very wise way, I think Al Pulin had a good eye for what would get attention as well as help launch this press, you know. And this was a book that was by a Pulitzer Prize winner, already came with some controversy built in, and it put BOA on the map right away. And he was still teaching at Brockport, living on Main Street in Brockport, and had, you know, interns and students helping out, but it was very much a one-man operation. And he would put out a book here and a book there. And then in 1980, we published a book called Yin by a poet named Carolyn Kaiser, and that won the Pulitzer Prize for BOA, which was really sort of a random, you know, thing to have happened. It might have been 1984. I may be misspeaking there. So anyway, at that point, it sort of gets BOA on the map even more, and we start to get some more funding, and, you know, we're nonprofit, so we depend on about 50-50 book sales and then donations and grants and things like that. So that started to make grants more available, and people were maybe sending in some donations to help this thing keep going. And from there, BOA moved into Rochester, downtown Rochester. We were above Arena's Floral Shop for a while, if people know that, next to the Little Theater. Mm-hmm. And that's when I joined BOA, and 22 years ago, that's where we were. And now we're in, it's called the Anderson Arts Building. It's right next to the Village Gate, which a lot of people are familiar with. Yep. Depending on how long you've been in Rochester, you might know it as the Fabrics and Findings Building or the Good Luck Restaurant Building or whatever it might be.
So that's considered Neighborhood of the Arts, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's right. So Perfect. We've been in there for now close to 20 years. And BOA continues to focus on poetry. That's what we're best known for. As I mentioned, we do some fiction and we do even some nonfiction about poetry, but we stay pretty close to that brand, you know, the poetry brand. And it's interesting because in the poetry community in particular, BOA has a very wide reputation, great respect. We continue to win national awards every year. We only publish 12 books a year. Wow. But literally, like last week, a book by BOA won one of the biggest poetry prizes in the country, the Penn Award, Penn Vogler Award, I should say. So, you know, it's, again, I hope that people in Rochester, if you're hearing about BOA for the first time, feel some pride in that.
Absolutely.
It is a niche thing. You know, a lot of people were traumatized by an English teacher along the way or something from poetry and have a sort of visceral reaction even hearing the name poetry that I might have to hearing the name algebra. Right. You know, but it's a beautiful art form, and it's something that we're very passionate about, obviously. And I think, you know, the reality is if there's not nonprofit publishers putting this stuff out there, there's not a real big profit margin in poetry, you know, and that's why Random House and so forth, you know, they'll pull out a poetry book here and there, but it's pretty rare, you know. So you have to think of it in terms of, if not for nonprofit publishers like BOA, poetry wouldn't really keep existing as a new art form that reinvents itself and so forth. So it's really crucial that I think people who believe in this art form, or quite honestly believe in the freedom of expression or art in general as, you know, an outlet, support, you know, nonprofits like BOA, because without us, no poetry going forward.
What a fascinating story. And just a little insight into me, I'm a big fan, I don't want to say fan of, but I kind of study World War II and that history, that segment of history. And so learning that the book that kind of put you on the map came from in that genre or about that, you know, Führerbunker, that's really fascinating to me. So one of the things that I've noticed in the last couple of guests that we've had on this podcast is how much the publishing industry has changed, not only in the last 20 years, but like in the last 5 years. How has that been for a nonprofit? Because you've got that to deal with too.
Right.
That's got to be very difficult.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, you know, it's interesting. when I first got to BOA 22 years ago, I was hired as a marketing director, and one of my jobs was to like go down to the photo place and get like headshots, prints, made for the paper press kits that I was putting together with reviews, and we were Xerox copying and we were mailing everything out. One of the first things I did at BOA was set us up with a MySpace page. And I was
nice.
like, you don't have a MySpace
forward
page?
thinking.
Yeah, that's right. So he got us right in there. And like, quite honestly, a website that was a little bit more navigable. But that alone, the advent of social media for a small nonprofit, especially a publishing house, is huge.
Yeah.
Because you just think of the expense. Now it costs, 72 cents to mail a letter or something. If we had to just mail everything out and we depended on that, it would break us.
Yeah.
But, and quite honestly, you get a book review or something, it may be in a niche journal that people don't see who are not really hardcore into poetry. Now we can put it out there and people can actually read these book reviews and they can read about the books and so forth. So that alone has been huge. And I will say BOA was one of the first in the pool of small press publishers to go into ebooks as well. Especially with poetry, there was a real issue because line breaks in poetry are really important, right? So with poems, you have those little short lines and it may have 4 words and may have 5 words. We call those line breaks where a poet decides to put the next line. Well, it used to be when you had a poetry book set up as an ebook and you expanded that, all those line breaks went away and they just went kablooey. You want to drive a poet crazy, take away their line breaks or just mess them up. You know what I mean? It's like, that is the rock in their shoe.
Yeah.
So we kind of figured out pretty early on how to lock in a file enough that wouldn't happen. And we got into ebooks right away. The most recent thing we've gotten into is audiobooks. I will say, we take great care to make sure that the books we publish are beautiful objects. We work with a great local designer named Sandy Knight who does our covers. We have great interior designers, and we really take a lot of care. We only do 12 books a year. They should look beautiful. You know what I mean? And it's artwork. So that's how we look at it. And I didn't want to get into audiobooks until I knew that finished object would be as beautiful and as, quite honestly, as controlled, meaning the sound is the same level and all those things as our print books. And so finally I got hooked up with somebody down at a place called Nashville Audio down in Nashville. It was a really random thing, but got hooked up with this person who just does audiobooks and said, I sort of expressed as a poetry lover, I need to hear the poet read the book themselves. And I think with, a nonfiction book or a novel or something, you can bring in talent and it'll sound great. But I feel like for poetry, you should really hear the poet's voice. But again, as a small nonprofit, how do you make that happen, right? How do you get the author reading their work and then get it, put together in this way that is professional, that you're controlling all these different factors that could go wrong. And then distribution, which is a big part of publishing. You can print a book anywhere now. Like I could have a book printed within a week. But if it's just sitting there, it's not getting published. It's just getting printed. Yep. There's a big difference between printing and publishing. Publishing as part of it needs to have distribution, right? So our distributor is Consortium Book Sales and Distribution, which is owned by Ingram, a larger corporation that bought Consortium. They all of a sudden one day said, our books are now, we can get audiobooks into the market, through Audible and through all these different outlets that go to libraries and so forth. So all of those things kind of came together at the same time, and we got into audiobooks. So I've only done maybe 15 or so. I will tell you the profit margin of audiobooks right now is like crazy. Like we lose money on audiobooks big time.
That's what I've been learning from the publishers that I've worked with recently. They just aren't interested in doing audiobooks, and the authors that sort of forced it on them and convinced them to do the audiobooks, because we've been doing audiobooks here for 8 years. And primarily, I agree with you about the author reading, especially in poetry. And I'm a big fan of books read by the authors. Like memoirs are my favorite of any kind of audiobook. I just love that. And it's so much more when you hear the story being told by the actual storyteller and not just, talent is talent. They're good at what they do. But hearing it come from the author, it just, I don't know, that emotion really comes through for me. Yeah. But I've heard that. I've heard that it's really difficult, especially for the smaller houses, to do audiobooks and not lose money.
Yeah. And I'll give you a very, this is a very straightforward sort of economic breakdown. So it costs us about $1,500 to produce an audiobook with music, to have it, all mastered correctly and so forth. And they sound beautiful. They really do. At one point when we first got into it, I realized we had sold about 1,000 audiobooks already. This was pretty early on. I was like, geez, that's amazing. That's a lot of books to sell, of poetry, of anything. And I looked, and we had made like $100.
Jeez.
So that's one book. So economically, it is a complete losing proposition for us. As a nonprofit, we've gotten some grants to be able to do it and so forth. Mm-hmm. So we can make it kind of work when we can get the grants to support it.
Yeah.
But one thing we've done is, if you go to boaeditions.org, which is our main website, you can buy books directly through BOA, which, first of all, makes a lot more money for the press. And I don't get into who takes slices of what, but everybody.
Yeah.
So if you're buying a book directly from boaeditions.org, that all goes to BOA and then to the authors through royalties. And now we're selling audiobooks also through our website. So you can get them on, Amazon or wherever you like to get, your audiobooks. You can buy BOA books that are available there, but you can also get them directly from the website. And quite honestly, it's kind of a pain for us to do, but we're trying to figure out how to make it economically feasible to be able to publish audiobooks. If people don't have the experience of having gone to a poetry reading, try it sometime. Because again, a lot of people are sort of intimidated by even the word poetry. Is they don't want anything to do with it. What I've seen over and over is you get somebody who's not interested in poetry or thinks they're afraid of it or whatever into a poetry reading with a poet, reading their work out of a book, and it's a different experience. You can hear the poet's inflections. You can hear maybe a little introduction about, the poem or whatever it might be to contextualize it. And it becomes a much more a less scary thing and a more, human experience that you had, kind of like going to the concert and buying the t-shirt. You go home with the signed book, you can read it, you can think about what that poet said. So part of getting into audiobooks was, how do we take that experience and sort of mass market it to the extent we can so that you can have the experience of hearing the poet read. And it's funny that you said that about, the authors reading themselves. I will say, so I'm also a writer myself and an author, and my first sort of book with the commercial publisher was called Growing Up Dead, The Hallucinated Confessions of a Teenage Deadhead. I am a Deadhead. I love the Grateful Dead. So I wrote a book about going to Grateful Dead concerts, and it's a memoir. And I actually went to Sutherland High School down the street here and grew up in the 80s here. Anyway, my publisher, Da Capo Press, put it out as an audiobook, and they hired somebody to read it. So I've had the experience of having a actor read my memoir like it's, I did this and I did that, first person. It's weird. Really weird. I've never been able to listen to it all the way through because it's
imagine.
Too surreal, you know? And I have other books of mine that have been turned into audiobooks with, actors reading them, and they sound great, and I don't have any issue. But that one that's the memoir's a tough one,
Oh yeah,
it's an odd one.
Yeah, so listening to someone else talk about your life in the first person has got to blow your mind.
Yeah, it's strange. So, but I hope people do go check out BOA's audiobooks because they do sound great, and we have some of our, our biggest name sort of poets like Naomi Shihab or Chen, different folks who that we've put out, these audiobooks, and I hope it does turn people on to poetry who love those poets, and also maybe some who aren't as familiar with poetry.
So you said you went to Sutherland, so you're a Pittsburgh guy. So how did you go down this path? Were you always literary? Were you the one of the kids that was always reading and spending time in the library?
I was always reading, but I was not a library person. I wasn't successful in traditional school setting, let's say. And I was kind of like a troublemaker,
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And
it seems like you don't want to talk about it too much.
Let's just leave it
I'm getting that vibe.
Yeah. No, I graduated, I made it through, but by the skin of my teeth, is a familiar phrase there. But what I did, I will tell you, is I realized that I really had a facility for writing. And I will tell you, the first thing that happened was I was always a huge music fan, and I always focused on the lyrics. And I was the youngest kid of 4, so I learned really quickly how to entertain. And one way that I could entertain the teenagers in my house was to recite music lyrics, as the song was going on. So but I loved it. I loved the language of it. I loved the wordplay. I loved the rhythm of putting words together and how songwriters were doing that. And so if I was doing a sleepover at a friend's house, and we both loved Bruce Springsteen, and this is 1982 or something like that, And so we said, all right, let's go into our separate little spaces here, and we're going to write a Bruce Springsteen song. We're going to come back and see who can do the closest to Bruce Springsteen, So we went out, and we came back in, and he read his, and it was just atrocious. And I read mine, and he said, oh, that's not yours. That's a Bruce Springsteen song. I said, I swear to God, I just made this up. It was the first thing I'd ever really written on my own. But it set something off in me, and I realized not only did I enjoy it, but like he had a reaction to it.
Yeah.
So I started to do this. I was also getting more interested in girls, and I realized that girls like guys who could express themselves, maybe in writing, and then I got a little like side gigs, writing love notes for friends who couldn't express themselves that way. Around Valentine's Day, my business boomed. And
that's hilarious.
Yeah.
I could see you out there like, yo, you need a Valentine's Day card? What do you need? I got one.
Yeah, so that was it. But, as a kid, I always loved reading. So, I mean, like you would have to pull me away from books. I just loved them, So it all sort of came together around those teenage years where I was like, I could also maybe be a person who puts words down on a page and does this thing. So I've been really fortunate, in my career to not only publish my own books and become a writer, but I love my job at BOA of helping other people get their books out into the world too. And it's, it's kind of like a toss-up of what's more rewarding. As an artist, you want to get your work out there. That is rewarding. Sure. But in a lot of ways, it's more rewarding to help other people, succeed and get their work out there and do this thing that, the literary community, after 50 years of existence for BOA, has come to depend on BOA as a press, that they know great work is going to come out of there. They know it's going to be leading the way forward on poetry for the next generation. So it's really, it's been really rewarding.
Would you say that you're sort of an oddball in your family, or is your family very similar to you? Like how?
Well, so I will say my one brother runs Golisano Children's Hospital in Syracuse. He's the executive director. My other brother is a dentist at Pittsford Family Dental is his practice.
So you're all very successful.
My sister is an MBA, from Simon School MBA, and in business, she's in Maryland. So they're all, everybody, I will say, has followed a path that is not only rewarding to them, but also is of service in the community. And I think that was instilled by my parents pretty early on. My father worked at Kodak. I grew up in Rochester in the 70s. Everybody's father worked at Kodak, or Xerox or Bausch & Lomb. But there was always this sense of not only do you need to do something that is, challenging to you intellectually and so forth, and that you're passionate about, and you got to make a living, but also do something that is valuable, to your community of service. So I think we've all sort of followed, in very different ways, have followed similar paths like that.
That's incredible. I'm always fascinated by families who are in service in some way, helping professions, or and to see. So did you say you were the youngest of four? Mm-hmm. So to see all four of you doing something that helps society in some way, in some service, is really cool. But were you the only one who was of the artistic kind of creative side? Because the other jobs seem very scientific almost, as opposed to writing and creative arts.
Yes. So I'm the only artist in the family, like, among my siblings. And it was interesting because when you're the youngest, and there was a little stretch there, and then came me. Mm-hmm. When you're the youngest, you kind of have permission to stay the youngest for a long time. Yep. And I think it worked well with a creative bent, because it's kind of like, oh, he's just, he was going to Grateful Dead concerts, was, driving his van back and forth across the country and sleeping in that. And all. So it was kind of like, that's okay. You know what I mean? It's like you have permission to do that and to be that person. And, but, my father was my father had a PhD in mechanical engineering. And he, very scientifically, bent in that way, but always reading. Always reading. So that idea of like the importance of language and literature and so forth was just sort of baked in, but I was the only one who took that and then ran with it. But I will say, if you're sitting in a room with my siblings and my parents and so forth like that, the way that people use language and bounce it back and forth is, I think, unique in that, there's a real facility for language, even if it's just like a little barb or something, a quip or whatever it might be, wordplay, like that's big in my family. And it moves fast, what I mean? Yeah. So if you bring in somebody from the outside, it's like there might be 3 of those things going back and forth before the person realizes what's happening, So that sort of joy of language, of whether it's conversation or putting it down in words, very much shared. But am I the artist in the family? For sure.
I know that you just insulted me, but that was such a well-crafted insult that I got to take my hat off. So now you're celebrating, or BOA is celebrating 50 years, and you've been there for 22. What was it like when you first got this job? How did you end up there?
Yeah. So I was hired as marketing director, and what I was doing at that time was just hustling different like literary things. What I mean by that is I was teaching in schools, so I might be the visiting writer going in and working with a middle school.
Now, had you already written your book by that point, or were you still, did you have anything published?
No, I was publishing like poems and stories and journals and things like that, but I didn't have my own book published.
Okay.
And so, but I was going and doing writing workshops in schools. That was a lot of what I did. I was teaching adjunct at RIT. I was teaching fiction writing there. I was getting some small grants and had a reading series going here in town at Artisan Works. And so I was really piecing together all these different things. And it's interesting because I knew the folks at BOA. It's a small office, and I would go up there sometimes and visit, but I would always think there's no way I can get a job here. There's just not that many positions here, quite honestly. And but the people who were running at that time, I think, saw what I was doing, which was just hustling in the literary realm, publishing. I was passionate about this. And I guess wisely thought, he's already doing marketing in this literary field. We'll just plug him in as marketing director. I didn't have any business experience. I didn't know what marketing really was. But I knew how to hustle around being a writer.
What was your major in school?
I was a English major.
English major.
Yeah. And I actually have a master's in education from Nazareth as well. So that's the sort of, I was going to be a teacher for a while, and then I realized that no, I really wanted to just stay with the writing part of it. So I was really fortunate when BOA contacted me and asked if I was interested in that marketing director position, not least of which because at that time my second son was just about to be born and I needed a regular job, I'd been hustling around for a long time. So I ended up having 3 children who are awesome, and none of them are writers, but they're all great in their own ways. And so I got hired at BOA as marketing director, and I started to figure out what that was. And it is funny because I do think back at what my responsibilities were at that time, and it was all very tactile. It was photocopying and mailing things out, and everything wasn't online. So I'm kind of glad that I had that experience of transitioning in, so I can sound super old when I talk about it now,
Yeah.
Back in my day.
Yeah.
So, and we have interns that come through BOA, I should say, too. We have a great intern from Golisano Institute right now, and all the different colleges at one time or another have sent BOA interns. And so we always have interns coming through from schools and stuff. And so you want to feel really old, trying to explain how to, address an envelope to somebody who's 20 who's never had to stick a stamp on an envelope before, stuff like that. So anyway, that's how I got in, and I immediately started doing editing and started working with authors because that's what I was already doing on my own too. And so over time, I've just been there. You sort of at a small nonprofit, you end up doing a little bit of everything. So there's really nothing that BOA does that I haven't dipped my toe into at some point. And then you stay somewhere long enough, you eventually end up running it, right? So that's what happened. So now I'm really grateful to have been in that position of leadership of the organization for over a decade now, and just sort of able to shape what we're doing more. And I pick the books that we publish and work with the authors. And, I see myself very much as a caretaker of what this thing is. It is not mine. I am responsible for it for this period of time. And at some point, hopefully somebody else becomes responsible for it and they keep it going another 50 years.
Yeah. The interesting part when you said how when you first started, you started the MySpace page and stuff. So what was that, early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s?
Yeah, it would have been 2003.
2003?
Yeah.
And so I'm sure you maintained that forward thinking. So you were always kind of at the forefront of whatever was going on digitally, because I know that there were a lot of folks that were doing print media at that time who, if they didn't go digital, they died. Yeah. That was it. And I know it's still like there's still a large section of the population that likes to have a book in their hand, that likes to sit down and read it. I enjoy, but I was always a big reader, but for some, since audiobooks, I mean, going back, books on tape, you remember that? I always was a big fan of that. And now, just how busy I am, I will read a book, but I'll go for the audiobook first. And it's just something that but there's nothing like actually having a book. Every time an author comes in here and reads their book, I'm like, can you give me a signed copy? Yeah. Because I still envision my wall of fame to have all the books on there with a picture of the author and stuff like that. Yeah.
But, for the exact reason that you're talking about, that's why it was really important to me that our audiobooks, sound as professional as our print books look. Because, there are lots of people in that position who this is how they experience books, and that's not better or worse or anything like that. It's just how it is, So if I know that some people are going to have their first experience or maybe their only experience interacting with a BOA Editions product through that medium, it better be as good as the print book. I obviously love print books. And so we take a lot of care to make sure they look and feel great and everything. But again, any format that somebody comes across a BOA product, I want it to be, as good as it can be. But I think of albums too, it's like a funny thing, right? All of a sudden we all switched over to CDs and then CDs went away and now albums are back.
Yeah.
And, again, as somebody who grew up in the 70s, I love albums. It's such a nostalgia for me to see them, hold them, look at them and all that different stuff. I think there will always be sort of an interest in that physical object that you can hold, no matter how digital everything gets. And even if it sort of goes away from that, it seems to cycle back again eventually.
Yeah, I mean, if you think you walk into somebody's house and you see, a library and you see bookshelves with all these wonderful books, and it's like, oh, that's really interesting. That's really cool. And be like, you see my library? It's right here.
Yeah.
That's it. I got 300 books in here.
Yep.
It just doesn't hit the same way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Going back to when you first published your first book, I'm always interested in the emotional state that you were in when you first realized this is going to happen. This is, your work is going to actually go out and people are going to be able to get it. What was that like for you?
For me as the author, it was, so I'd published poetry collections before, and that tends to be a much smaller sort of audience. And a lot of times it's like other poets who are reading and stuff. And, but so my first bigger book that came out, that Growing Up Dead book, was a little intense because it was a memoir. And because I followed the Grateful Dead on the road and did all sorts of different things that are associated with the Grateful Dead on the road and so forth. And I was a young parent at that point. And so I was essentially outing myself, admitting all sorts of, ne'er-do-well behavior, let's say, in print. And I had written many things over the years, and quite honestly, some people would read it, but it was never a big audience, right? So I wrote that book almost like, you know what, forget it, I'll just tell the truth. I'll just tell this story, right? Because nobody's going to read it anyway, because I've been doing this for a long time. And of course, that's the one that people got interested in, and it got picked up, and I got an agent and all this different stuff. So I ended up going, now I'm doing radio shows around the country and going out to San Francisco and being on KFOG, on their morning show, and just doing all sorts of stuff and having articles and reviews and stuff like that. And it kind of threw me because I'd never had anybody really pay attention. And now they were paying attention to this thing that was really my life, you know, just raw, laid out there. And sometimes asking kind of rude questions, or just morning zoo type shows are the worst, They just want to did you take a bath? I think I could smell
you must have really stunk back then.
Like that.
What'd you smell like?
Right. Yeah. You're like, okay, haha, yep, that's good. So, but it was a great experience for that, but it was jarring. I think what you're asking me is what was it like, sort of kind of being exposed like that, out there.
Yeah.
And that was like a crash course in it. And I sort of joke, but that was the beginning of my career as a public Deadhead, because now I've written other books about the Grateful Dead, and I'm sort of regularly asked about them and will comment. And, I've been in documentaries that have been released. And so there's one called Box of Rain. If you want to check it out, it's on, I know you can get it through Amazon and different stuff like that, but it's really well done. And I have a pretty big part in that documentary as well.
Very cool.
About a young girl at that time who went on, tour with the band and her experiences. So that's been really rewarding because I still love that music. I listen to it all the time. I go to the concerts, and I think it's given me the ability to sort of translate what I think the value of that is to other generations. And I think, to be able to express things that people have lived through, but they can't necessarily express it themselves. And when you publish a book like that, one of the things that happens is people can take that and then they can give it to somebody that cares about them, who don't understand why they would disappear for months on end and go to these concerts and say, this is why.
Yeah.
They weren't able to articulate it, but I was able to put something down that helps them explain themselves to their people, so that was really cool too. And eventually you do this, and over the years, you sort of develop a little bit of an armor around it where you can do that without letting all the other stuff in,
Yeah. I know when I'm 7 years sober, and when I first, announced it, this was when I was doing a morning radio show, and I started talking about it on the podcast and talking about it more publicly. And I remember some people close to me were like, how do you, are you sure you want to let people into that part of your life? And when I got the messages from people that said, thank you for saying that stuff, because this is stuff that I've been wanting to say, but I've been interested, I'm going through these things and you've encouraged me to take that step. That's what made it rewarding for me, is that when you affect other people and you can help them through something, that's when it's just like, okay, it makes sense now.
Yeah.
This was a good thing to do.
Well, I met with my sponsor right before this interview. So I'm 10 years sober myself.
Congrats.
And I know exactly what you mean, and one of the things you learn in recovery and sobriety is that you get out of yourself. And once you start giving back in that way, that's when the real recovery happens, right? It's not all about me,
Absolutely.
right? It's like you got to give it away to get it. So
switching back to BOA and the local, I love the local arts community in Rochester. Every type of art, music, writing, acting, theater, all of that is just so vibrant. And I've always been a big fan. I grew up in South Florida, so I'm a transplant, moved here in 2007, and have definitely adopted, I consider myself a native born here, just even though I'm not. Because I just love it here so much, and there's just so much to do and so many talented people. Does BOA do you guys sponsor any kinds of festivals, or do you do anything like that where you encourage people to submit their work or that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, we do, but BOA does it on a national scale. So I wouldn't say there's a disconnect between us and the local community. It's just that we sort of serve the local community a little differently.
Okay.
And I look at it more like having interns from the schools who come in and get experience in publishing a nonprofit and so forth. And we do support, we work a lot with Writers and Books, which is a local literary organization that, has workshops and different things, much more community involvement. But our authors are mostly, they're all around the country and all around the world. So we have like open submission periods where people can submit work and so forth. But again, it's sort of the net is cast a little bit wider than that.
And I love that. I love that you just happen to be in Rochester. You're not, a Rochester only company.
Right.
And that's huge.
Yeah.
The one, so we just actually met with Michael over at Writers and Books yesterday. He was here talking about audiobooks and stuff like that. So we're excited to also kind of get plugged into that community here. I always considered myself kind of a writer back in the day, but then when I started hanging out with and talking to real writers, then I realized I'm just a hobbyist guy that likes to scribble things. But I said this before, and I'll continue to say it, that I am just fully amazed by anyone that can take a book from concept to complete, it's done, all the editing and then printing and then putting it out there. I know some people have said it's like having a baby or, things like that. And as a filmmaker, we made a movie a couple of years ago, and I remember what that process was like. And it was, when you were done, it was like, do you have a lot of other book projects that you're hoping to do in the future? Or
yeah, and I think I have that same respect for writers, and I think being a writer myself has helped me a lot at BOA, because I understand what authors are going through, and their feelings of like, this is their baby, and somebody might have been working on it minimum 2 years and sometimes 20. I published a book by a woman who had literally spent her entire life, she's in her 70s now, trying to tell the story of her father's, incarceration and so forth, and finally was able to do it after all these times. So I have a real respect for that as well. And when I work with authors and I work on books, I don't take it like, here's our next product. Mm-hmm. No, this is somebody's life, And one of the first things I say to all of our authors is, we will work on your book and then I'm going to work on other books, but this is yours. You're going to live with this book forever. I want you to love it. I want you to hand it to your family and so forth. So yeah, that's helped me a lot. And then for myself, I'm putting the final touches on a novel that I've just been working on. My last book that came out was a novel called Merch Table Blues. And it was about I call it a sex, drugs, and rock and roll murder mystery. So nice. A band's touring around and there's murders happening and there's a cult following that's involved and you have to kind of figure out, who did it.
I love it.
And this book is called The History of the All, and it's basically the origins of that cult that appears in Merch Table Blues.
Very cool.
So, so I'm always working on my own writing, and I
love that.
Yeah.
And will you be put out by BOA, or do you have how does that work? Like, could that even happen?
Right. I mean, it could. I would consider it a conflict of interest because we're a nonprofit taking grants and donations and so forth. So I would feel like it's kind of not quite okay to then publish my own work. So I've never done it. And quite honestly, I love having a writing career that has nothing to do with my BOA work.
Yeah, no, that's
a lot of my authors don't even know I'm a writer, because I'm writing about music and things like that they might not be even reading. So I have a lot of authors who don't even know I write. And that's fine with me. I like to keep those things separate. So, but I really do think ethically I would feel weird about that. So I don't cross those streams.
No, that makes perfect sense. So what's say in the next 5 years for BOA and for you?
Yeah. I think, we're going to keep doing what we've done. So that might not be like the sexiest answer because everyone wants to know like what the advances and stuff. But I think in a lot of ways, like real success is to be able to keep putting out poetry books, and keep finding the next poets who will articulate for their own generation, So my real ambition with BOA is to keep it going, which is in nonprofit world, no small feat. We did, as a lot of arts organizations did, recently lost an NEA grant that we had been funded since the 80s. Oh, and for those who don't know, that is funding for the arts that is on a national level. And BOA was among the first presses to ever receive NEA funding. And so it's something that we had come to count on since the early 80s. And to have that, we were actually given the grant and then told that we were not going to get the money for that grant this year. So it's tough, right? So that was the biggest single funding source that we had every year consistently, not our book sales or anything like that. So we're bouncing back from that, and you have to find new ways to keep going like that. So success to me is like keeping doing what we're doing, finding some great new authors who are going to articulate for their own generation as well, and then trying to create this thing as solidly as possible with a foundation. As our 50th anniversary, we have a special fundraising campaign going. We're trying to build up our endowment fund to just get it more and more solid so that this thing can keep going for years to come. And again, I think, because we don't focus on local writers and authors, a lot of people don't even know that BOA is here. But I think it's something that if Rochester people became more aware of it, they would really find pride like they do at George Eastman House, or Griff Fagan Dance Company or whatever.
Yeah.
That's the sort of level that BOA is working at in this particular field.
BOAeditions.org is where you can find the website, and I'm sure there's links there for donations and more information. And if they wanted to reach out to you, they can reach out to you there or on various social media platforms. I'm so glad that my friend David Mamano introduced us. This is great to learn about BOA and everything that you guys are doing and have been doing, and to learn about you. I actually want to read or listen to your books. They sound really cool. And going back for many years being a musician, I was never really a big Deadhead, but that whole world has always been fascinating to me. So I definitely want to hear your story. Anything that we didn't cover that you want to make sure people know?
No, I just say, come and check out the website and check out what we're doing on social media and stuff. And you can see a lot about BOA Editions through that way. And also we do, if you're in Rochester, we have a fundraiser in September, we're calling it the BOA Gala. To celebrate the 50th, we have an amazing author named Naomi Shihab Nye, who's one of the biggest poets in the world. And we're fortunate to have her as a BOA author. She's going to come and read for it. And so you can find all the information and ticket and information and so forth on our website.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Peter, so much for coming in. I really appreciate it, and looking forward to seeing more from you and from BOA.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.